like to welcome all of you. That's what I used to do as a teacher, you stare down the talkers and walk over to their table. All the troublemakers. Anyway, welcome to the conference. It's a special event for all of you as science teachers, and I always say you are the professionals of the association, the ones that come to the conference, pick up good ideas, and take them home and make your classrooms better places for all the kids, and that's where the payoff is. This morning we're pleased to have Sam Kean join us. He's a very popular science writer. He has a number of books, and I'll say a little. Sam will be describing that. Just a very quick little description. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Dueling Neurosurgeons, The Disappearing Spoon, and The Violinist's Thumb. Stories appeared in Best American Nature, Science Writing, The Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times Magazine, Psychology Today, Mental Floss, and Slate, and his work is being featured on National Public Radio, Radio Lab, All Things Considered, and Fresh Air. So he's one of these young firebrand guys that have lots of good ideas, and he's going to tell us, I'm sure, might even mention your book, Sam.
You might.
Okay, overview.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining me this morning. You can hear in the back, okay? It's loud enough. Good. Okay. So I had a bad go of things in about third grade or so. I came down with strep throat something like a dozen times that year. And every time I came down with it, I got to stay home from school, so it wasn't all bad as far as I was concerned. But I wasn't feeling very well, kind of achy, sore throat. So my mother would come in, and she would take my temperature with one of those old-fashioned mercury thermometers that you can see in the picture here. And I admit I was a little clumsy when I was a kid. I was also very prone to talking to myself. I had a little imaginary friend or whatever. Talking to myself when no one was around. So my mother would come in, take my temperature, and either leave the room, get distracted, or whatever. I would start jabbering away, and not infrequently, this would happen. The thermometer would fall on our hardwood floor, and it would break. The mercury would go spilling out of the end. But I admit I was always kind of secretly excited when that happened, because I loved watching the mercury roll around on our floor. And my mother was actually very cool about the whole thing. She never panicked, she never made us evacuate the house or anything like that. She would actually get down on her hands and knees with a toothpick, and she would brush the little spheres of mercury toward each other. And my favorite part, I'm kind of looking over her shoulder at this, my favorite part was when she had the two little spheres right next to each other. And she would give them one final nudge, and then they would jump together into this slightly larger sphere that was perfectly seamless. And I just thought it was the most amazing substance I'd ever seen. Like these little liquid ball bearings rolling around on our floor. Very shiny, very attractive, but it was a metal at the same time. I thought, wow, this is the coolest stuff ever. So when we got introduced to the periodic table for the first time in school, maybe even that same year or so, around third grade, first thing I tried to do was find mercury on the periodic table. And I looked all over the periodic table, and I couldn't find it. I just didn't see it. And of course, mercury is on the periodic table, but the symbol for mercury is Hg. Neither of those letters are actually in the word mercury. And I thought, well, that's kind of stupid, but why would that be the symbol if those letters aren't actually in the word? So then I looked into it a little more, and I realized that, it actually this symbol comes from some Greek and Latin words. And I thought, wow, I didn't know that they knew about this element thousands of years ago. That's really interesting. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that, they just didn't know about this element. They kind of incorporated it into their culture in different ways. There was a god that they associated with this element, with mercury. Also a planet that they associated with. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that, mercury really does have this rich, interesting history. Alchemists, for instance, were obsessed with mercury. They were always using it in different sorts of experiments. Has a long history in the exploration of the New World as well. All the gold and silver And sometimes they were shipping, whole ships full of mercury over to help out with those operations. I even found kind of an unusual connection to exploration history. I'm from the United States, from the Midwest, from South Dakota, and there are two very famous explorers there that explored the middle part of the United States, Lewis and Clark. And from that part of the country, we always had a very long Lewis and Clark section in our local history class. But there was one story about Lewis and Clark and Mercury that they didn't teach us in school, and that actually ended up being one of my favorite stories about this element. The story involves this man right here, named Dr. Benjamin Rush. He's considered one of the founding fathers, we call them, of the United States. He signed our Declaration of Independence, that whole thing. He was living and working in Philadelphia during the 1790s, and was best known during his lifetime, for staying back during a yellow fever epidemic in the 1790s. A lot of other doctors basically just fled the city, abandoned their patients, but he stayed behind to treat a lot of people who wouldn't have gotten treatment otherwise. Unfortunately for them, his pet treatment for pretty much any ailment was this mercury chloride sludge he would feed them, often until their hair started falling out, their teeth would get loose and fall out, they'd start drooling. The idea at the time in medicine was that people really wanted to know they weren't being ripped off. They wanted to know that the medicine was having some sort of effect. They wanted to feel something inside them. And with mercury, you definitely feel something when you ingest it. So people knew they were getting their money's worth when they were taking a mercury medicine. Obviously, it's not how we think about medicine nowadays, but it's kind of their reasoning back then. Anyway, Dr. Rush thought these pills were really fantastic, and so he started to mass produce them. He called them Dr. Rush's bilious pills. Each was about 4 times the size of an aspirin tablet, so very, very large pills. And there's really no delicate way to put it, but these pills were extremely powerful laxatives. They called them thunderclappers. And the idea was that if Lewis and Clark or other explorers, they were wandering around and they ate something maybe they shouldn't have, or drank some questionable water or something, they could take one of these pills and it would basically flush them out. It would get rid of everything in their system. Mercury is a poison, your body does not want it inside you, goes through you very quickly. And it's actually had kind of an unusual side benefit for historians and archaeologists today, in that they can still actually pinpoint a few places where they know Lewis and Clark must have stayed because the level of mercury in the soil is just too high for it to have been natural. So from this one element then, from just mercury, I learned some unusual history, but I also learned etymology, word origins. I learned about alchemy, mythology, poison forensics, even a little bit of chemistry. And in fact, that's really what got me excited and interested in science for the first time, was hearing these stories about things like elements or biology, stars, all these different stories about different parts of the natural world. And so when I got into high school, I started taking all the science classes I could. Physics, chemistry, biology, anatomy, all these different things. Eventually went to college at the University of Minnesota. And again, was taking all the science classes I could. Decided to be a physics major there. And things were going really well, loving my classes, doing well in them, until about 3 years or so into my physics degree when things changed for me a little bit. Started working in a few different laboratories, and things like this started to happen. I was breaking test tubes and things. Maybe my thermometer experience should have been a bit of foreshadowing for this kind of stuff, but it was frustrating being in lab. But even more than that, I just realized I wasn't enjoying the labs in the same way that I thought I was going to enjoy them. When you're doing a lab in high school and college usually, generally students know how the lab is supposed to turn out. It's pretty obvious when something goes very wrong, either there's no reaction or there's an overreaction, it kind of explodes or whatever. But I started working in some labs in college and realized that, the reason they're doing these experiments is you don't always know what's going to happen. That's the point of doing the experiment. And a lot of people like that sort of mystery aspect. They like the problem solving, tinkering with their equipment, all those kind of things. I ended up just finding it very frustrating because it wasn't playing to my strengths. I didn't enjoy it as much. So what I decided to do was kind of go the complete opposite direction. So I was still getting my physics major, but on the side, I decided I was going to get an English major as well. So I started taking classes in reading, writing, all these sorts of things, and really enjoyed those literature classes. But eventually I realized that I missed the science, and I still wanted to be involved in the science, even if I wasn't in the lab all the time. And so that's when I decided that the best bet for me would be to kind of write about science, kind of marry my two interests there. And that's how I got started, writing magazine, newspaper articles about science, things like that. And that eventually led to my first book, which was The Disappearing Spoon. And the premise of the book was to find a funny or spooky or weird story about every single element on the periodic table. And I did manage to cram, all 118 elements in there. Some just get a little cameo, but they all did manage to make at least a brief appearance in there. And I can say with this book, in addition to these great stories that I learned about Mercury, things like that, I had a couple motivations for writing the book. One of them was that, I don't know what exactly your experience was in chemistry class, but there was always a periodic table hanging in the classroom somewhere. But there were just huge swaths of the periodic table that we never, ever talked about. There were dozens and dozens of elements that just never, ever came up in class. So I wanted to know what are the stories of all those other elements. I wanted to give them a bit of a personality. But the other big motivation for me in writing the book was that I knew that there were some really great stories out there about elements that everyone thinks they know really well, but that have kind of an unusual backstory to them if you look a little bit deeper. And maybe one of the best examples of that, of an element with an unusual backstory, is the element aluminum, or aluminium, I have to say it here. We always say it wrong these days, but aluminium. So we all know aluminum today from, like pop cans and aluminum foil. It's kind of a throwaway element, one we don't think too much about. But for a long time, during the 1800s, believe it or not, aluminum was actually the most precious metal on Earth. It was worth far more than silver was. It was worth far more even than gold was. And the reason why is that even though aluminum is very common, it's the most common metal in the Earth's crust, whenever it's in the Earth's crust, it's usually very tightly bonded to another element, like oxygen. So when scientists in the 1800s started to produce the first pure samples of aluminum, it was considered kind of a miraculous metal. It was very light, but also very strong, very attractive. It basically had everything you would want in a metal. And because it was so hard to mass produce, it became something of a status symbol for kings and emperors to get their hands on this metal. Right here, you're looking at an aluminum centerpiece that was created for one of the emperors of France. And that is aluminum on the top, and then that's gold beneath it, because aluminum was considered the more impressive metal, so you would obviously want to put that on top. There was another emperor of France who had a prized set of aluminum cutlery that he reserved for his most favored guests and banquets. And the lesser nobility were actually reduced to eating with gold knives and forks. And it was considered very embarrassing to be eating with the gold knives and forks when there was aluminum cutlery available. Even some national governments got into this act, decorating their public monuments with different things. One good example of that happened in the United States, in Washington, D.C., where I live right now. We have a monument on our national mall called the Washington Monument. It's basically a tall, skinny pyramid and obelisk down there. And when they were putting this up in the 1880s, they decided they were going to put at the very tippity top of the Washington Monument a 6-inch pyramid of aluminum. And the reason they did that, there were two reasons actually. If you've ever seen a picture of the National Mall or been down there, You know there's nothing else around the Washington Monument. It's just sticking up by itself. So they knew lightning was going to strike it at some point, probably many points, very often. So they needed a metal of some sort at the top as a lightning rod to conduct electricity down to the ground. But the other reason they did it is that the US government at the time was kind of bragging a little bit. And they were saying, you know, we're such an up-and-coming industrial power that we can put aluminum on our public monuments. Isn't that impressive? And you know, other people were impressed for a while, because not long after this, the aluminum market pretty much just crashed completely. What happened was a few chemists in Europe and one chemist in the United States, ended up figuring out how to mass produce aluminum, make it on an industrial scale for the first time. And the American chemist, actually, a very famous chemist named Charles Hall, was just 23 years old when he figured out this process, barely out of college. They called him the aluminum boy wonder. And probably no one ever made more money more quickly on the periodic table than Charles Hall did. When he opened the doors of a company now called Alcoa, Aluminum Company of America, he was making, or they were producing about 50 pounds, about 20 kilograms of aluminum every day. And that was plenty to meet demand basically across North America. Just 20 years later, he was shipping out 20,000 pounds of aluminum every single day. So around 10,000 kilograms every single day. And he could barely keep up with demand. He died a very, very wealthy man. And I like this story because not only does it kind of illuminate this unusual history of an element we all think we know well, but it also goes to show, kind of give a perspective on the other elements on the team and make you think a little bit, what elements that we don't think about nowadays could be worth a lot of money in the future? Or what elements that we all think are really important nowadays, in the future, maybe they won't care much about. It kind of gives you a different perspective on the worth of these elements over time. And to me, the periodic table really is the richest source of stories out there in science because it touches on so many different areas of life. And I think it's good to kind of expose students to that idea that the periodic table or whatever we're talking about, it doesn't just stop at the lab door, or at the science classroom door. You can really connect it to art and music and poisons and wars and all these different things if you just dig a little bit deeper into the elements. So that was my first book, The Disappearing Spoon. And then after that, I wrote a second book called The Violinist's Thumb. And it has the same sort of feel as the first book, in that it's really story-based, trying to use stories to get at the science. But in this case, the focus was a little bit more on genetics, biology, something like that. And you can see the cover there. It's a little violin with the DNA helix. Does anyone notice the mistake on the cover? It's subtle. I hear whispers there. He's got it right there. That's it. The DNA helix is going the wrong way. Yes, it should be twisted the other way. Very few people have noticed. I didn't notice it. It was my fault. It's kind of a quirky little thing. But anyway, one of the reasons I really enjoy the topic of DNA, or I like the idea of DNA, is I like the idea it's kind of this unifying principle of biology, in that, whatever creature you look at, whatever organism, they all have DNA inside of them. And DNA works the same basic way in all known forms of life. Whether you're talking about guinea pigs, or bacteria, toads, toadstools, slime molds, dung beetles, US politicians, whatever. Genes and DNA work the same way in all of these bizarre creatures. And I just thought, wow, that's really a fascinating, it's like a unifying principle of biology. But pretty soon, as soon as I started writing the book, I realized that there was actually something that separates or that distinguishes the DNA of human beings from the DNA of other animals. And that has to do with the names of genes, the names of these stretches of DNA. Because I don't know how many of you have had the experience of looking at a medical paper, maybe a genetics paper, or even just sometimes reading a story in a newspaper or magazine or something, and you come across a human gene name, And it's often these very long, jargony words and numbers and Greek letters appearing in the middle randomly sometimes. They're just very, very hard words to even like read and parse, just get your head around what these words mean. But when scientists are discovering and studying animal genes, they actually have a little bit more leeway. They can be a little bit more creative, they can have a little bit more fun naming these genes. And in particular, I am thinking about the gene names of this guy right here, the fruit fly. Now, they might not look it, they don't look particularly witty, I don't think, but the fruit fly has inspired probably more funny and unusual gene names than every other animal out there. There are different fruit fly genes named Groucho. There's one called Smurf, Lost in Space, Fear of Intimacy, Tribble, after those multiplying fuzzballs on that famous episode of Star Trek. There's the Fate Sausage gene. I have no idea what the Fate Sausage gene does, but it's a pretty good name. There's the Tin Man gene. And if the Tin Man gene gets mutated, fruit flies cannot develop a heart. So, kind of makes sense. Thank you. There's a gene that leaves fruit flies exceptionally tipsy after a tiny, tiny sip of alcohol. It's called the cheap date gene. So, that makes sense. Probably my favorite gene name, though, doesn't come from a fruit fly, or wasn't discovered in a fruit fly, I should say. It was actually discovered in a mouse first. And that is the POK erythroid myeloid ontogenic gene. Now, at first glance, this is a perfect example of a terrible gene name, where some of those words, you can barely parse what even they're getting at with these words. But if you look a little bit closer, the first three letters are POK, then there's an E. In the beginning of the next word, there's an M. It kind of spells out Pokemon. And in fact, the scientists who discovered this gene, they named it the Pokemon gene. They published a paper about this. It became the official name of this gene. And everyone had kind of a good laugh about this whole thing. Except, you can see right after the word Pokemon there's a little R with a circle. And that means copyright restricted. And the lawyers at Pokemon Inc., it turns out, were not very amused by this whole thing. Because the Pokemon gene actually contributes to the spread of cancer in mice. And they didn't want their cute little pocket monsters confused with tumors. So they threatened to sue the heck out of these scientists. They were really going to take them to the cleaners on this. Until the scientists, kind of backed down. They gave it some other terrible gene name eventually. But for a few minutes at least, there was a Pokemon gene. Now, one of the real reasons I was excited to write this book was, I think all of us know, obviously, that genetics is very important for medicine, diagnosing diseases, trying to treat diseases, things like that. But in the past few decades especially, genetics has exploded. It's really spilled over the banks into so many other different fields. You can talk about genetics in art nowadays, you can talk about genetics in music, you can talk about genetics in archaeology, even things like genetics in computing, using DNA to store information or to run processes on these sort of half hardware, half biological computers. They're really doing some amazing things with DNA nowadays, and I wanted to use the book to highlight a lot of those different areas. And I thought I would talk a little bit about one of my favorite areas in the book, using DNA to do history. In particular, a subject that I like to call retrodiagnoses. So the basic point of retrodiagnoses is you want to figure out, how your favorite historical celebrity died. So you look at when they lived, you look at where they lived, you look at what they suffered from during their lifetime, you look at all these different things, and from that you try to piece together basically how they died. If you look at doctors, or if you look at medical journals, I should say, you can see that doctors are really kind of incorrigible on this stuff. They just, flip through, and you see like dozens of different articles saying, so-and-so died of this, and this emperor had this, and this artist had this, often very contradictory diagnoses, because they're dealing with things that happened a long, long time ago. And there's been kind of a movement nowadays that people are saying, maybe genetics could shed some light on doing these kind of things. They have tried to diagnose people like Frederick Chopin, Abraham Lincoln. They actually did go in and do some interesting genetic work on King Tut and his lineage. And I talk a little bit in the book about what they did to try to figure out if he suffered from any diseases, how he died, who his parents were, all these different kind of things. But the story I want to talk about now is actually the title story of the book, The Violinist Thumb, involving this man right here, Niccolo Paganini. So Paganini is usually considered the greatest violinist who ever lived. He was an Italian violinist, active in Europe in the very early 1800s. Pretty much every king, every emperor, every pope wanted Paganini to come play for them because he was the absolute best. If you've ever heard those stories about musicians, usually blues musicians or something, where they had supposedly sold their soul to Satan in order to get their talent, a lot of those stories actually started with Paganini. He was the first one that all those rumors were swirling about. Now, of course, there were some non-fiction reasons why Paganini was so good as well. And one of the primary ones was that he had these amazing, even sort of freakishly flexible hands. So, for instance, he could take his pinky and he could bend it into a right angle with the rest of his hand just by going like this, bending it out like that, or a right angle. So it gets worse, because he'd actually also put his hand down flat on the table, lift his pinky and thumb, and then touch them behind his hand just by going like this with it. So he could do things with his hands you should not be able to do with your hands. But that gave him an advantage when he was playing the violin, because he could stretch his hands incredibly wide, he could do fingerings that other violinists simply could not. So he had that genetic advantage to be able to play the violin. And actually, it's almost certain from a modern perspective that he had a genetic disorder of some sort, because he wasn't just his hands that were very flexible. All his joints. He could bend his elbows backwards, his knees went the wrong way. He was like a circus rubber man, basically. In addition to some other symptoms that make us think that, yeah, he probably had one of these genetic disorders. And I chose it as the title story for the book for a couple of reasons. First of all, we usually think about something like music being on one side of the spectrum, very artistic thing. And we think about something like genetics being on another side of the spectrum, very sciencey sort of thing. But if you know a little bit about music and you know a little bit about genetics, you can actually see that, wow, there's this kind of cool connection between them. You can understand one in terms of the other if you know a little bit about both. And I thought it was really cool to be able to make that connection between two things that we normally keep on kind of opposite sides of the spectrum. And there was another reason why I thought it would be good for the title story of the book as well, and that I think it imparts an important lesson about genetics and where the science is going. Because in addition to having these amazing hands, Paganini was also a very hard worker. He loved playing and practicing music. And he also grew up and lived in an environment that rewarded musical talent to a very high degree. So it wasn't just his genetics, it was his genetics and his environment, his temperament, all of those things working together to make him who he was. And I think that's an important lesson for people to understand about genetics nowadays, because we hear more and more often about a genetic influence on a lot of mental traits. And it makes people a little worried sometimes. They think that we're sort of genetically determined exactly by what they discover inside of ourselves. But that's not how geneticists really think about the science nowadays. They're not talking about individual genes in isolation inside cells. They're talking about genes working with the environment, genes and temperament, all of these things working together to make someone who they are. And Paganini, I think, is a really nice example of that, because you can talk about his genetics, you can talk about his hands, it's very fun, but you miss something if you don't talk about all of those other things as well. So again, it makes this point about genetics and environment working together in a really memorable way. So that's why I chose it as the title story. So that was my second book, Genetics, about the violinist thumb, about genetics. And I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about my third book, The Dueling Neurosurgeons, And one thing people often want to know when you're writing a book is they want to know, like, what inspired you to write this book? Why did you write this book instead of, 100 other books you could have possibly written? And I can say with this book, what inspired me to write it was doubt, or skepticism, mistrust, whatever you want to call it. Because a few years ago, I was reading a story about someone who got injured in one part of his brain, and his behavior changed in this very strange way after. And I was reading this story, and I said to myself, this sounds like baloney. I said, I don't think this story is true. I think they maybe messed up some details in the story. But anyway, I kind of forgot about it for a few weeks. And then coincidentally, I was reading something different. Again, read a story about a woman this time, suffered an injury in her brain, and her behavior shifted in this very unusual way. And again, I thought, this is baloney. This story cannot possibly be true. So I set out to disprove these authors, to show that they didn't know what they were talking about. And of course, they knew what they were talking about. I was the one who was wrong. But it inspired me to look a little bit more deeply into this topic. So what kind of stories are we talking about? Well, I'm sure we've all heard stories about, people getting injured in one part of their brain and they lose their memory goes on the blink, or maybe they're paralyzed on half their body, something like that. So it wasn't stories like that, because I'd heard things like that. What got me about these stories was how very, very specific the deficits were. So for instance, I think we all generally know what kind of animals these are in the picture here. Even if we don't know the genus and species name, we can all pretty much recognize what animals these are. But it turns out that there's a spot in the temporal lobe, on the side of the brain, in the temporal lobe, near the temple. It turns out there's a spot in the temporal lobe that if it gets nicked, all knowledge of animals can just sort of disappear from people's minds. So these people can still tell individual faces apart, no problem. They can tell plants apart, they can tell human-made objects apart. But dogs, raccoons, elephants, lizards, fish, all look exactly the same. They cannot tell these things apart anymore. Or sort of the opposite can happen. Where some people, they get nicked in another spot in the temporal lobe, they can tell animals apart, but plants, they just can't tell them apart. Fruits and vegetables, they all look exactly the same to them. And I thought this was very strange at first, but when I looked into it a little more, I realized it didn't make sense anymore. Because if you think about our evolutionary history, you think about our ancestors way, way back then, wandering around the savannah or a forest or whatever, there were some people who were very good at classifying and recognizing different types of plants and animals. They said, okay, these animals are dangerous, stay away from them. These animals are good to eat, these animals make good companions. With plants, they said, okay, these are good to eat, these are poisonous, these make good medicine. So again, classifying, recognizing different types of plants and animals. Those people ended up having an advantage because they weren't eating the poisonous animals, they were going near, or eating the poisonous plants, going near the poisonous animals, ended up having an advantage. And eventually, this idea of being able to classify and recognize plants and animals got kind of hardwired into our brains. And again, it's a big advantage for our species. But the downside of that, of it being hardwired like that, is that if that spot gets injured, then poof, that knowledge can just sort of disappear from the mind. And that seems to be what happened to these individuals where they can't recognize plants and animals. So it gives kind of an insight. This injury gives an insight into our evolutionary history. And I thought the other story that sort of startled me when I started off on this was even more unusual. Again, I'm sure we've all heard stories about people who get injured in one part of their brain and then they lose the ability to speak. It's sadly very common. I've highlighted one area there, in Kean there, called Broca's area. That's very important for speech production in the brain. But something else can happen in some people to give them a language deficit. In that sometimes it's not so much the Broca's area or another area that gets damaged, but the neurons or the biological wires that get the information from the brain to the mouth are the part that gets injured. So the Broca's area, whatever, that's okay, no damage there. but the wires connecting the brain to the teeth, tongue, and lips get damaged by a stroke or something. And the end result is the same in that these people just can't speak. They can't have everyday conversations. But it can have a bit of an unusual side effect in that once you start studying the brain, one thing you learn pretty quickly is that there are a lot of detours and back alleys inside the brain. There's lots of different ways for information to get routed all over the place. And there happens to be a pathway that runs from the language parts, like Broca's area, into the emotional centers of the brain. And then the emotional centers of the brain can then get in touch with the teeth, the tongue, and the lips. And so again, the direct connection is broken, but there's this back alley through the emotional centers. So with these people, when you're trying to engage them in conversation or something, they can't get the words out. They're very frustrated by it because that direct connection is broken. But if you rile them up, if you provoke them, if you get their emotions involved, it turns out that these people can swear at you, no problem at all. They'll say, you beepity beep beep, and then they'll sort of cover their mouth, because in a lot of cases, they didn't even realize they could produce these curse words. They were just bubbling up out of the emotional centers of their brain. Or sort of something related can happen, in that there are detours in the brain that run from the language centers to the parts of the brain that help process music. And from there, they can get in touch with the mouth. So in these people, even though they can't speak, they can sing song lyrics, no problem at all. In fact, there was a case in the United States a little while ago now. A congresswoman was giving a speech there in Arizona, down near Mexico. And she actually got shot in the head while she was giving a speech, had to go to rehab, all this sort of thing. And she lost the ability to speak because of where the damage was in her brain. But it turns out she could still sing song lyrics. And she was singing songs like Girls Just Want to Have Fun. I don't know why Cyndi Lauper, it was a song that sort of stuck with her. But by singing these songs in rehab, by practicing them, she eventually regained some of her ability to speak. So it's not just sort of this arcane fact about the brain. They can use these things in rehabilitation in order to help people. And once I read these stories and kind of looked up a little bit more, I realized that, wow, I bet you could write a whole history of the brain just based on different injuries and what they teach you about how the brain works. And then sort of the cartoon light bulb went off over my brain. And I thought, boy, I should write a book like that. That would be a lot of fun to write. And so that's what the Dueling Neurosurgeons is. It's basically marches around the brain from part to part and shows you what happens when each part of the brain gets injured. Because if you think about it, basically before about 25 years or so ago, scientists had no way to look inside the brain. There's a skull around it, you can't x-ray inside it and see what's going on. And basically for the first 4 or 5 centuries of neuroscience, what they had to do was wait for people to get injured in different parts of the brain, see how their behavior changed, and then infer from that what that part of the brain did. So that's basically what the book does, is it talks about these sort of fascinating medical cases and what we can learn from them. But I actually wanted to wrap up talking a little bit about something slightly different, in that it wasn't an injury so much as a different sort of brain structure. Very unusual brain. And actually, I think it's a famous case up here in Canada. Less so in other parts, but I think here it's fairly famous. So this story got started I think it was like 3 or 4 hours outside of Vancouver in about 2005 or so. A woman there found out that she was pregnant, found out she was going to have twins, so she was excited about that. But during one of the later sonograms, the doctor said, I'm sorry, I have some bad news. Your twins are conjoined. What used to be called Siamese twins. But the woman decided she was going to have the kids anyway. And as you can see in the picture here, they are actually conjoined at the head. They have a Siamese brain. And I should emphasize that the twins, Krista and Tatiana, they are still alive today. They're healthy, they're fairly healthy, they're happy, they're in school. So things turned out about as well as they could have for the 2 little girls. But because their brain is connected like this, they show some sort of unusual behavior. Now specifically, the part of the brain that's connected in them is a part called the thalamus. So the thalamus usually sits in the very center of the brain, and what it is a relay center for information. So information comes in, or really specifically for sensory information in the brain. So information comes in from the eyes, from the ears, from the tongue, whatever, and it goes to the thalamus, and the thalamus decides, okay, this information needs to go that way, this information needs to go to this part of the brain. It's a relay center for sensory information, one of the very first stops for information inside the brain. Now, because these two girls share a thalamus, they share sensory information to a large degree. So, I mean, what does that mean? What are the consequences of that? Well, it turns out that if one of the girls is, say, taking a sip on a cup of juice, the other girl can taste the juice in her mouth. Or you give one of them a shot at the doctor's office, the other one grabs her arm in pain. You tickle one of them, the other one starts to laugh. They fall asleep together. They maybe even dream together. And scientists have never seen anything like this. This is really unique in the history of neuroscience. And it brings up a lot of questions, including some sort of philosophical questions. And probably the biggest question, I think, is, are these two girls one person somehow? Or are they actually two individual people? And the answer, maybe it's a little ambiguous. Maybe there's not a clear-cut answer here. But I think a lot of the evidence points to them being two individual people. One thing the girls do is they often walk up to somebody, and one of them will say something like, "I am just me." And that's kind of an odd thing to say. Like, no one here would walk up to someone and just say that. And it seems kind of obvious. But in this case, maybe it's a little less obvious. But it seems like the girls kind of want to assert themselves as individual people. They have kind of this instinct to define themselves as individual people, even though they're connected like this. And I think another anecdote illustrates their individuality even better, in that one of the girls happens to like ketchup. She loves ketchup on her hot dogs, or fries, whatever. It turns out her sister, unfortunately, hates ketchup and is always kind of scraping her tongue whenever her sister eats it because she can taste the ketchup in her mouth. And it's sort of an amusing anecdote to hear about. But it has a good lesson underneath because it shows that they are getting identical sensory input, but they're reacting to it in different ways. They're reacting to it as individuals. So again, I think it shows that they are individual, they are different people. And that's really one of the exciting things, I think, now about neuroscience, is that we have a pretty good handle nowadays on what individual parts of the brain are doing. But really recently, the focus has been on trying to figure out these kind of bigger, more systematic things. Not only things like language and memory that involve lots of parts of the brain, but these bigger, more philosophical questions like, who am I? How do I know who I am? Where does consciousness come from? Because of cases like this and other things, we really can get at a lot of these questions for the first time. So that's kind of how the book builds, is up to these big, big questions. So that was a little bit about me and my books. But I think the real lesson here for me in thinking about what I've done with these books is that I really wanted to emphasize in all of these books that there's different ways to get science information across. A lot of people go through their classes, they remember certain things, but it gets a little sketchy for them. And I think one reason why that is that the human brain is not so great about remembering information, individual information, facts, dates, data, things like that. But human beings are very, very good about remembering stories. We are fantastic at remembering stories. And if you can present things as a story, those stories often stick with people a long, long time. Things with characters, with conflict, with drama. And I think you can fit a lot more science in than you might think just by getting just by telling people stories. It's not everything, of course. There's a lot more to science than that, but it can be a really great way to engage people. And I feel very lucky that I've been able to do this with myself for a living. So again, thank you everyone for joining me this morning. Yeah, we have time for questions. If you want to raise your hand, and I can repeat them if you're in the front row. Go ahead.
I know students love hearing stories, and I know some people are natural storytellers. If you're not a natural storyteller, what are the key elements that you need to be aware of to become a natural storyteller?
Okay.
And if you can apply that, I don't know, there's a particular application of the science area, because science is focused to it.
So he asked, what is it? People do love hearing stories, so what are some tips about telling better stories, and is there anything specific about telling stories in science? I don't think there really is anything specific about telling stories in science. I think the things that make a good story are, having characters that people can either relate to or dislike. Both of those things are very important. Having heroes and villains. Having conflict helps. Having something interesting happen, making sure it's interesting. If nothing else, just giving students a little bit about the background of the person, their life, things like that, just brings it alive a little bit for them. And again, I don't think there's anything in particular about science except that, some people do get a little intimidated by science. They think it's going to be too hard, and they kind of clam up a little bit. I think stories can be a good way to lower their barriers a little bit and to get them engaged without kind of frightening them off right away. Anyone else? It's like a classroom here. Yeah.
I've actually read all three of your books. I've enjoyed them all thoroughly, and I was wondering if you have any projects that you're working on at the moment that might be coming out soon.
Yep, so he asked if I have any books coming out in the future. And I'm actually wrapping up a new book right now. I'm doing the copy editing. It's going to be out next summer, next July. And it's about the atmosphere, so the air we breathe. It's going to be called something like Caesar's Last Breath. And the premise of it, if you're interested, is you take a deep breath, you inhale lots of different gases, oxygen and nitrogen, the big ones obviously, but there are little bits of anesthesia, there are refrigerants in there, there's pollutants, there's all these different gases. And if you look at them, some of the gases are basically been around since the very first days of Earth. Some of them only came around when life arose on Earth. Some of them are very new and have only come around since human civilization. So you can basically reconstruct a whole history of the world every time you take a breath, just based on those different gases. So each chapter kind of picks one gas that we inhale, tells a story about it, where it comes from, and how we use it, things like that, and then goes through the whole history of the world. So that's the book.
When you're reading about science, and writing about science, who are the science writers that you like to follow most and why?
So he asked about what science writers I like to follow. And a few people come to mind. And I guess one thing, I'll answer the why part first. What I like about them is it's just something fresh or unusual. They're either good writers and it's lively, or they have a nose for finding really good stories. So those are the two things I really look for. In addition to things you need for any story, like accuracy and things like that, avoiding hype. That's something that is important in science, especially like medical science, avoiding hype and things like that. Some people who come to mind, writers I enjoy. Amy Stewart, I enjoy her work. Deborah Bloom wrote Poisoner's Handbook. It's a great book. David Quammen is a very good nature writer. I also like reading Neil Stevenson. He writes fiction more, but on a lot of scientific topics. And I think fiction can be good to read because you get a good idea of how to illuminate characters quickly, how to describe things, makes it a little more lively. And also it can help expand your imagination for science, which I think can be good and interesting. And the last book that comes to mind is a book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb. Very heavy, very fat book. It's an investment to get through, but it's a very nice, well-done history of the atomic bomb, obviously. Anyone else?
Do you have some of your books here for sale?
They are selling them. I think we're going to, after this, migrate down there. And I'll be hanging around signing books for anyone who wants one for themselves or a gift or whatever. They will have some.
I actually didn't ask that lady to ask that question because that's what I was trying to say. I was going to thank Sam for raising a lot of interest. I guess I'd be accused of being a storyteller myself. I'm fascinated by stories. I'm also a musician, and the relationship between music and science, there's all kinds of bridges and crossovers. We're going to, as we leave, thanks very much, Sam, for bringing this to our... We're going to, for those of you that want to purchase the books, this is the holiday season, and you know, you might even know somebody in your department who could really use a good book that would maybe brighten up his or her teaching. But we're going to walk down to the bookstore in the foyer area. For those of you that want to purchase books, they will be sold after that. But if you want to get Sam to sign any of the books, by all means, we're going to go right now down to the bookstore, those of you that want to purchase a book and get a signed copy. Okay, I think that's it, Sam. Okay. We shall go downstairs. Thank you very much, folks.